Ever wondered what it really meant to be called a duke or a baron in the Middle Ages? These weren't just fancy names to make someone sound important. They were loaded with power, responsibility, and sometimes even danger. Picture this: a world where a single title could mean the difference between ruling a kingdom or losing your head. That's the reality behind the grand titles we often hear in stories or see in movies. But here's the thing: most of us have no idea what these titles actually stood for, who got to hold them, and why they mattered so much in shaping history. Take the word duke, for example. Today, it might sound like something out of a fairy tale, but back then, it was a title earned through blood, battle, or sheer political cunning. Dukes weren't just nobles sipping wine in castles. They were military leaders, landowners, and sometimes even rivals to the king himself. And that's just the beginning. Every medieval title, from the lofty emperor to the mysterious viscount, had layers of meaning that influenced wars, alliances, and the lives of thousands. These titles weren't just words, they were tools of power, carefully crafted to control, reward, or intimidate. So why does this matter to us today? Because these titles didn't just vanish. They evolved, leaving traces in our governments, traditions, and even our language. The way power was structured back then still echoes in modern politics, business, and society. Over the next few minutes, we're going to unravel 30 of the most epic medieval titles, digging into what they truly meant, who held them, and the wild stories behind them. You'll discover how a baron could be both a loyal servant and a king's biggest headache, or why a knight was far more than just a sword-wielding hero. This isn't just history, it's a hidden key to understanding how power works even now. So let's step into the past together and uncover the real stories behind these legendary titles. When we hear the word king, we might picture a figure in a golden crown sitting on a throne, but the reality was far more intense. In medieval Europe, a king wasn't just a ruler. He was considered God's representative on earth, chosen by divine right. This belief wasn't just symbolic, it was the foundation of his power. If a noble questioned the king's authority, they weren't just rebelling against a man, they were defying the will of heaven itself. That's why coronations were sacred ceremonies, often involving anointing with holy oil, as if the king were being blessed directly by divine hands. But divine favor didn't mean an easy life. Kings like Charlemagne, who ruled much of Western Europe in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, spent more time on horseback than in palaces. Warfare wasn't optional. It was how kingdoms expanded, defended themselves, and even paid their armies. Victories like Charlemagne's conquest solidified his reputation, but defeats could unravel everything. And then there were the nobles, powerful, ambitious, and always watching for weakness. A king had to balance rewarding loyal lords with keeping them from growing too strong. One wrong move and a rebellion could erupt, like the revolts Henry II faced from his own sons. Then there's the mythic side of kingship. Legends like King Arthur blended history and fantasy, creating an ideal of the just heroic ruler. Real kings used these stories to their advantage, crafting images of themselves as wise, brave, and destined to lead. Richard the Lionheart, for example, became a legend in his own lifetime, less for governing England and more for his crusades and battlefield exploits. But even famous kings had vulnerabilities. Richard spent years imprisoned on his way home from the Holy Land, and his kingdom nearly bankrupted itself to pay his ransom. And what about queens? Their role was anything but passive. While kings led armies, queens managed kingdoms in their absence, brokered alliances through marriage, and sometimes ruled outright. like Elena of Aquitaine, who was both Queen of France and later England. A queen's influence could shape entire dynasties, yet her power was often precarious, dependent on her husband's favor or her son's success. The crown might sit on one head, but it took a web of loyalty, strategy, and sheer force of will to keep it there. Queens in the Middle Ages carried far more weight than their ceremonial roles might suggest. While kings dominated the battlefield, queens often ruled the political arena, sometimes from behind the scenes, and other times with undeniable authority. Take Elena of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women of her time. She didn't just marry two kings, she actively shaped the politics of both France and England, even rallying her sons to rebel against their father, Henry II, when she felt her influence was threatened. Her story shows how queens could be both architects of peace and instigators of war. But not all queens had such freedom. Many were bound by rigid expectations. Producing heirs was their primary duty, and failure could mean exile or worse. Yet, even within those constraints, clever queens found ways to wield power. They acted as regents when kings were away at war or too young to rule, like Blanche of Castile, who governed France with remarkable skill while her son Louis IX was still a child. These women didn't just keep the throne warm, they made decisions that shaped kingdoms. Marriage was their greatest political tool. A queen's union could secure alliances, end feuds, or even merge entire territories, as when Ferdinand and Isabella united Spain through their partnership. But this also made queens vulnerable. Foreign-born queens, in particular, often faced suspicion from nobles who saw them as outsiders. Margaret of Anjou, the French-born Queen of England, struggled for years to defend her husband's shaky reign, only to be branded a schemer by her enemies. And then there were the queens who took power outright. Matilda of England fought a brutal civil war to claim her rightful throne, while Isabella of France overthrew her own husband, Edward II, to rule through her son. These women shattered expectations, proving that the crown wasn't always a man's burden to bear. The title Queen might have come with limits, but history shows us again and again, when given the chance, they rewrote the rules. Now, just below royalty stood the dukes, the mightiest of nobles. Unlike kings, they didn't claim divine right. Their power came from land, loyalty, and sheer force of will. In many ways, they were the true pillars of medieval power, holding kingdoms together or tearing them apart. Dukes stood as the ultimate warrior aristocrats, their very title echoing the Latin dux, meaning leader. Originally Roman military commanders, these men transformed into the backbone of medieval power structures, governing territories so vast they often rivaled small kingdoms. Take William, Duke of Normandy, who didn't just rule his lands, he crossed the English Channel in 1066, toppled King Harold, and rewrote history by seizing England's throne. That's the kind of raw ambition a duke could harbor, but their power wasn't just about conquest. Dukes controlled the lifeblood of feudal society, land. They granted estates to lesser nobles in exchange for loyalty and military service, creating networks of obligation that could make or break a kingdom. Imagine a duke's court, part war council, part administrative hub, where decisions about crops, taxes, and justice were made alongside plans for battles. A duke's word could raise an army or doom a rebellion, like the Duke of Burgundy's fateful alliance with England during the 100 Years' War, which tilted the conflict's course. Yet this influence came with constant tension. Kings relied on dukes to defend their realms but feared their independence. When a duke grew too strong, like the Plantagenets in Aquitaine, crowns trembled. Rebellions weren't just clashes of steel, they were chess matches of marriage alliances, trade monopolies, and whispered betrayals. Even loyal dukes walked a razor's edge. One misstep could see their lands confiscated or their heirs disinherited. And then there were the titles within titles. Some dukes bore honors tied to specific regions, like the Duke of Brittany or Milan, turning their names into symbols of regional identity. Others, like the Habsburgs, used ducal power as stepping stones to empires. Their legacies linger today. Modern duchies like Luxembourg trace their roots to these medieval giants. The title Duke wasn't just a rank, it was a vortex of ambition, loyalty, and raw political will. Guarding the edges of these ducal domains were the marquises, a title born from the chaos of borderlands. While dukes ruled the heartlands, marquises stood as sentinels where kingdoms blurred into danger zones. Their story is one of frontier grit and strategic marriages, but that's a tale for the next chapter. Marquises were the frontier sentinels of medieval Europe, holding lands where kingdoms ended and danger began. Unlike dukes who ruled secure heartlands, a marquis's power came from the ever-present threat of invasion. Their very title, from the Old French marche, meaning border, reveals their life's purpose: to stand guard where civilization frayed at the edges. Picture a chain of fortified castles along the Pyrenees or the Danube, each commanded by a marquis ready to rally knights at a moment's notice. These weren't ceremonial postings, they were survival zones where a single weak leader could mean lost territory. The Spanish Reconquista offers some of the most dramatic examples. As Christian kingdoms pushed south against Muslim rule, marquises like the Marqués de Cádiz became living legends, leading raids and sieges that expanded Spain's borders mile by bloody mile. Their rewards, lands taken from the enemy and titles that echoed their deeds. El Cid, though not technically a marquis, embodied this warrior aristocrat ideal. But marquises weren't just brutes with swords. They had to be diplomats too, negotiating with neighboring lords and bribing nomadic tribes to prevent raids. A smart marquis knew when to fight and when to forge alliances. In Germanic lands, the title Margrave carried similar weight. The Margrave of Brandenburg, for instance, didn't just defend the Holy Roman Empire's eastern frontier. He transformed his patch of wilderness into a dynasty that would one day rule Prussia. That's the hidden legacy of marquises. Their borderlands often became cores of future kingdoms, yet their daily reality was gritty: constant skirmishes, burned crops, and the strain of keeping soldiers fed through lean winters. What's fascinating is how these frontier lords shaped culture. Isolated from royal courts, many marquises developed unique customs, even languages. The Marquis of Provos's Occitan poetry influenced all of Europe, proving that sword hands could also hold quills. But when the call to arms came, everything else stopped. Their castles weren't palaces but stark command centers, where the tapestries showed battle maps, not hunting scenes. Now, just behind these border warriors stood the counts, less glamorous perhaps, but the true administrators of medieval life. If marquises were the shields of the realm, counts were its gears, turning the king's will into everyday order. Counts were the hands-on rulers of medieval life, the noble administrators who turned royal decrees into local reality. Unlike dukes with their sweeping domains or marquises guarding wild frontiers, counts governed manageable territories, often just a single county, where they served as judge, tax collector, and military commander rolled into one. Picture a bustling castle courtyard, peasants bringing disputes over stolen livestock, merchants paying tolls on imported goods, knights mustering for patrols, all under the watchful eye of the count. This was governance at its most personal, where power wasn't just proclaimed but felt in everyday interactions. Wealth could elevate a count far beyond his modest title. Take the Counts of Flanders, whose control over Europe's richest wool trade turned their lands into economic powerhouses. By the 12th century, their coffers rivaled kings, funding lavish courts that became magnets for artists and scholars. But this prosperity came with political headaches. When the Count of Champagne allied with rebellious French nobles in the 13th century, his banking networks nearly bankrupted the crown, proof that even minor nobles could punch above their weight. Yet most counts lived less glamorous lives. Their castles doubled as courthouses and tax offices, where they settled land disputes or negotiated crop quotas with village elders. A wise count knew his people's names, which families could supply archers, which fields yielded the best grain because survival depended on these details. In war, they led regional levies rather than grand armies. In peace, they enforced the king's law while skirting its edges for their own benefit. Their deputies, the viscounts, handled the gritty work counts deemed beneath them. Where a count might host a feast to impress his peers, a viscount was likely knee-deep in tax ledgers or mediating a brawl between rival millers. This division of labor kept the feudal machine humming, but that's a story of its own. Viscounts were the unsung workhorses of medieval nobility, the deputies who kept the feudal machine running while counts and dukes took the glory. Imagine them as the chief operating officers of their time, buried in parchment rolls, settling boundary disputes between villages, or calculating how much grain a peasant owed his lord. Their title literally means viscount, but don't mistake their subordinate role for weakness. Over time, many viscounts carved out power bases so robust they outshone their superiors. Take the Viscounts of Bayonne in southern France. Starting as mere administrators for the Count of Foix, they played rival factions against each other until Bayonne became virtually independent, minting its own coins and even negotiating directly with kings. What made Viscounts indispensable was their grip on local knowledge. While counts traveled to royal courts or battlefields, viscounts stayed put, learning every quirk of their territory, which bridges needed repair, which merchant families could be trusted, which knights were brave but reckless. This made them irreplaceable. In England, the Sheriff of Nottingham from Robin Hood tales, that role descended from viscount-like figures who enforced law and collected taxes. Miss a payment and the Viscount's men would be at your door, have a grievance, and his court was your only hope for justice. Some Viscounts turned paperwork into dynasties. The Viscounts of Limoges in central France began as humble enforcers for the Duke of Aquitaine, but grew so wealthy from controlling trade routes that they built towering castles rivaling their dukes. Others, like the Viscount of Carcassonne, became masters of intrigue, switching allegiances between warring counts and kings to keep their lands intact. Their survival depended on a rare mix of bureaucratic skill and battlefield readiness. One day they might mediate a quarrel over stolen sheep. The next, they'd be leading a militia to repel bandits. Yet history often overlooks them, focusing instead on flashier titles. That's a mistake. When feudal systems faltered, it was usually because viscounts were corrupt or incompetent, proof of their quiet centrality. Without these deputy lords, the medieval world would have descended into chaos, one unpaid tax or unresolved feud at a time. Now step into the shadow of the barons, the men who could make kings tremble. Unlike viscounts who worked within the system, barons were the system's wild cards, capable of propping up thrones or smashing them to pieces. Their rise and fall would reshape medieval politics forever. Barons were the power brokers of medieval politics, men who stood so close to kings they could whisper in their ear or grab them by the collar. Unlike counts or viscounts, whose authority was tied to specific regions, barons derived their status directly from the crown. When a king granted land to a baron, it wasn't just a gift, it was a contract written in blood and steel. In exchange for vast estates, barons pledged military service, supplying knights and soldiers whenever war loomed. But this relationship was far from one-sided. A shrewd baron knew his worth, and kings who ignored their counsel often paid the price. Take the Magna Carta, that famous document signed in 1215 under duress by King John of England. It wasn't just a philosophical statement about rights, it was the work of furious barons who'd had enough of arbitrary taxes and broken promises. These men didn't revolt to overthrow the crown, they fought to force the king to play by the rules. Their castles, like Dover or Warwick, weren't just homes, they were bargaining chips. A well-fortified baron could shut down trade routes or shelter rebels, turning his stone walls into political leverage. Yet barons weren't always rebels. Many were the crown's staunchest allies, like William Marshal, the legendary baron who served 5 English kings and saved the monarchy during the disastrous reign of John. His loyalty wasn't blind, it was strategic. By backing the throne, Marshal ensured stability, which meant his lands thrived. That's the baronial paradox. They could prop up kings or tear them down, depending on which path served their interests. And then there were the baronial courts, where justice was dispensed with a mix of local custom and royal decree. A baron's word could mean the difference between a peasant keeping his land or losing it to a rival. Some ruled with fairness, earning respect. Others exploited their power, squeezing taxes until villagers starved. This tension between protector and oppressor defined their legacy. When a baron raised his banner, his people never knew if it signaled salvation or ruin. Now picture the men who fought under those banners, the knights. If barons were the king's right hand, knights were his clenched fist, armored warriors sworn to serve but far more complex than the legends suggest. Knights were the medieval world's ultimate paradox, glorified in songs as paragons of chivalry, yet often surviving as hardened pragmatists. Their title conjures images of gleaming armor and jousting tournaments, but the reality was far messier. To become a knight wasn't just about mastering the sword. It was an intricate social climb, starting as a page at 7, then a squire learning combat and courtly manners, and finally, if luck and connections aligned, a dubbing ceremony where a lord's sword tapped their shoulders. This wasn't just a promotion, it was entry into a privileged class, one that came with land, peasants to work it, and obligations that could stretch from the battlefield to the tax ledger. Take the Templars, the most infamous knightly order. These weren't just warriors but monk soldiers who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, then amassed staggering wealth through banking and land deals across Europe. Their dual identity as holy men and elite fighters made them indispensable to kings during the Crusades, but also targets when those same kings needed cash. Philip IV of France didn't just disband the Templars in 1314. He burned their grandmaster at the stake to avoid repaying loans. That's the dark side of knighthood. For every Lancelot, there were a dozen mercenaries like Sir John Hawkwood, who switched sides in Italian wars depending on who paid best. Chivalry, the code that supposedly guided them, was more propaganda than practice. Tournaments advertised noble ideals, bravery, loyalty, courtesy, but real warfare was brutal. Knights ransomed defeated foes instead of killing them, but only if they were wealthy enough to pay. Peasants got no such mercy. And while literature painted knights as defenders of the weak, many exploited their power, like the German robber barons who extorted tolls from travelers. The gap between myth and reality could be vast, yet the legend persisted because it served a purpose. Kings needed loyal enforcers, and what better way to secure loyalty than to wrap it in oaths of honor? Now shift your gaze from the clash of swords to the silence of cloisters. If knights were the sword arm of medieval society, the clergy were its conscience, and sometimes its cunning strategists. Their titles held sway over souls and thrones alike, proving that power wasn't always won by the blade. The Pope stood at the pinnacle of medieval power, a figure who could make emperors kneel with a word and send armies marching with a decree. Unlike kings who ruled lands, the Pope claimed authority over souls. His titles like Vicar of Christ and Supreme Pontiff weren't just ceremonial, but declarations of divine mandate. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, his speech didn't just inspire piety, it ignited a century of holy wars that reshaped continents. This was spiritual power with earthly consequences. A single excommunication could topple kings, as Henry IV of Germany learned when Pope Gregory VII left him standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging forgiveness. Yet the papacy was far from invincible. For centuries, rival factions vied to control it, leading to the Great Schism in the 14th century, when 3 men simultaneously claimed to be God's true representative. Imagine the chaos kingdoms forced to choose sides, saints denouncing each other, and ordinary believers unsure whose prayers would reach heaven. Even at its height, the Pope's power depended on alliances with secular rulers. Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 800 wasn't just a religious act. It was a political deal that bound church and state together, setting a precedent for centuries of tangled loyalties. Behind every great pope stood the cardinals, the scarlet-robed strategists who shaped the church's destiny. More than just advisors, they were kingmakers in the truest sense, gathering in secret conclaves to elect new popes, often after weeks of fierce bargaining. A cardinal's red hat symbolized willingness to shed blood for the faith, but many shed more ink than anything else, drafting treaties and theological arguments that swayed empires. Take Cardinal Richelieu of France, who a few centuries later would prove that a churchman's robes could hide the mind of a master politician, steering his nation through wars and intrigue. The medieval church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was a vast network of patronage, where cardinals granted bishoprics to loyal allies and collected taxes from every parish in Christendom. Their palaces rivaled royal courts in splendor, filled with artists and scholars who turned Rome into a cultural beacon. Yet for all their power, cardinals walked a tightrope. Cross the Pope and you might find yourself demoted, anger your king, and the church's protection might vanish overnight. Their influence was immense but fragile, a reminder that even in a world ruled by faith, politics never slept. Now consider the bishops beneath them, men who wielded both crozier and scepter in their dioceses. If cardinals were the church's elite diplomats, bishops were its frontline governors, turning heavenly decrees into earthly order. Bishops wore 2 crowns, one spiritual, one temporal, and their authority stretched far beyond the church walls. While cardinals played the high-stakes game of papal politics, bishops were the ones turning doctrine into daily reality across Europe. Their title came from the Greek episkopos, meaning overseer, but by the Middle Ages, they were more than just religious supervisors. Picture a bishop like Odo of Bayeux, half-brother to William the Conqueror, who not only blessed troops at Hastings in 1066 but fought alongside them in full armor. These men blurred the line between shepherds and warlords, commanding wealth that dwarfed many kings. Take the prince-bishops of the Holy Roman Empire, who ruled cities like Cologne and Mainz as both spiritual leaders and secular lords. Their cathedrals doubled as treasuries and fortresses, their dioceses as tax districts. A bishop's mitre wasn't just a hat, it was a symbol of judicial power, granting him the right to hold courts and levy fines. In England, bishops sat in the House of Lords, shaping laws that bound everyone from barons to blacksmiths. Their influence reached into every corner of life. They validated marriages, certified wills, even decided which crops could be grown on church lands. Yet their power came with constant tension. Kings demanded loyalty, popes demanded obedience, and local nobles chafed at sharing authority. Thomas Becket's murder in 1170 showed how explosive these conflicts could get. When Archbishop of Canterbury defied Henry II over church rights, knights took it as a cue to spill his blood on the cathedral steps. Even holy bishops weren't above scandal. The Bishop of Winchester's lavish palaces, funded by England's richest monasteries, sparked rebellions among peasants who starved while he dined on peacock and wine. What made bishops indispensable was their dual role as administrators and symbols. They ordained priests to tend souls, but also managed vast estates that fed armies. They interpreted scripture, but also enforced canon law with real-world consequences. When famine or plague struck, people didn't look to distant popes or kings. They turned to their bishop, expecting miracles or at least grain stores. That trust, once broken, could ignite revolts. The medieval church's strength and its greatest vulnerability lay in these men who stood at the crossroads of heaven and earth. Now consider their right-hand men, the archdeacons. If bishops were the CEOs of their dioceses, archdeacons were the relentless middle managers, enforcing discipline where the bishop's gaze couldn't reach. Their story reveals how faith and bureaucracy became inseparable in the medieval world. Bishops weren't the only churchmen wielding secular power. Abbots ruled over monasteries with the authority of feudal lords, turning quiet cloisters into economic and political powerhouses. Picture a sprawling abbey like Cluny in 12th century France. Its walls enclosed not just praying monks but vast storehouses, workshops, and even its own courts. The abbot who presided over this micro-kingdom wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was a landlord, judge, and banker rolled into one. Monasteries controlled huge swaths of farmland, and the abbot decided how much grain peasants owed, which fields lay fallow, and when to sell surplus crops at market. Some, like Abbot Suger of St. Denis, became trusted advisors to kings, using their influence to fund grand building projects that doubled as displays of both piety and power. But running a monastery required more than prayer books. Abbots had to be shrewd administrators, balancing the spiritual ideals of poverty and humility with the practical demands of sustaining hundreds of monks. The Cistercians, known for their austerity, still became wealthy through innovative farming techniques, turning marshlands into profitable sheep pastures. An abbot's success was measured in souls saved, but also in barrels of wine stored and coins added to the treasury. When conflict arose, they didn't shy from battle either. During the Crusades, the Teutonic Order's abbots commanded knights, proving that a monk's robe could hide a general's strategic mind. The tension between sacred duty and worldly power often sparked scandals. Critics like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux railed against abbots who lived like princes, their tables laden with fine foods while the poor starved outside monastery gates. Yet without these pragmatic leaders, medieval Europe's intellectual and agricultural revolutions might never have happened. Abbeys preserved ancient texts, pioneered new farming methods, and even offered sanctuary to fugitives, all under the abbot's watchful eye. Their dual role as shepherds and CEOs made them as vital to the medieval world as any king or knight. Now consider the men who stood one step below them, the priors. If abbots were the CEOs of monastic life, priors were the hard-working middle managers, ensuring the daily rhythm of prayer and labor never missed a beat. Their quieter influence kept the system running, but that's a story of its own. Abbots ruled their monasteries with a blend of spiritual devotion and sharp political instincts, turning remote cloisters into nerve centers of medieval life. Imagine a typical Benedictine abbey, not just a quiet retreat for prayer, but a bustling complex of libraries, workshops, and barns, all humming with activity under the abbot's watchful eye. These men were more than monks. They were feudal lords in robes, managing estates that rivaled those of barons. When Abbot Suger rebuilt the Basilica of St. Denis in the 12th century, he didn't just create a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, he engineered a propaganda coup using stained glass and soaring vaults to showcase both divine glory and his own influence with the French crown. Monasteries were economic engines and abbots their shrewd CEOs. They pioneered agricultural techniques like crop rotation, turning wastelands into fertile fields that fed thousands. The Cistercians, led by their abbots, transformed Europe's landscapes with vast sheep farms whose wool funded their expansion. But this wealth came with dilemmas. Should an abbot hoard grain to trade for precious manuscripts or distribute it during famine? The choice could define his legacy. Some, like Abbot Hugh of Cluny, walked the tightrope perfectly, balancing piety and pragmatism, while others faced revolts from peasants who resented tithing to opulent abbeys while their own children went hungry. Their political role was equally fraught. Kings relied on abbots for loans and counsel, but tensions flared when church and crown clashed. Thomas Cromwell's dissolution of England's monasteries under Henry VIII revealed just how much power these institutions had amassed and how dangerously they'd entangled themselves with secular authority. Yet even in their twilight, abbots left indelible marks. The illuminated manuscripts they commissioned, the schools they founded, and the roads they built shaped medieval Europe long after their cloisters fell silent. Now step beyond the abbey walls to the village priest, the clergyman who brought the church's teachings and its demands to the common people. If abbots were the church's elite, priests were its foot soldiers, living elbow to elbow with the flock they shepherded. Their daily struggles and small acts of grace reveal the medieval church at its most human. The parish priest was the medieval church's frontline representative, a figure as familiar as the village blacksmith but far more controversial. While bishops and abbots moved in lofty circles, priests lived elbow to elbow with their flocks, baptizing newborns, blessing crops, and delivering last rites to the dying. Their wooden churches were community hubs where gossip mingled with scripture, and their word carried weight in matters both sacred and mundane. Yet for every priest who embodied compassion, like St. June Vianney centuries later, there were others who exploited their position selling indulgences, demanding excessive tithes, or bending confessionals into tools of control. Education was a luxury many priests lacked. In remote villages, it wasn't uncommon to find a priest who could barely recite Latin prayers, let alone explain them. Some inherited their roles simply because they were the only literate person for miles. This gap between spiritual authority and actual knowledge led to bizarre blends of faith and folklore. Imagine a priest blessing fields with charms meant to ward off witches, or promising heaven to those who bought scraps of holy rope said to have touched a saint's relic. The church frowned on such practices, but in places where hunger and disease were constant threats, people clung to whatever comfort they could find. Yet priests also held communities together. During plagues, they often stayed when others fled, administering final sacraments at great personal risk. The parish register recording every birth, marriage, and death wasn't just a religious document. It was the closest thing to a legal identity for most peasants. And when famine struck, a good priest might persuade his bishop to open monastery granaries, or even defy corrupt lords. Their influence was a double-edged sword. They could absolve sins or spread fear with sermons about hellfire. Now shift your gaze from crowded villages to solitary cells. If priests were the church's voice, hermits and anchorites were its eerie conscience, voluntarily walled away from the world, yet somehow more present in the medieval imagination than many living souls. Hermits were medieval Europe's spiritual extremists, men and women who fled society not for madness, but for divine clarity. Unlike monks in bustling abbeys, Hermits sought God in the raw silence of caves, forests, or even hollowed-out trees, places where the world's noise couldn't drown out heaven's whispers. Take Saint Cuthbert, who spent years alone on the windswept Farne Islands, praying waist-deep in icy North Sea waves. To villagers, he seemed half ghost, half angel, emerging rarely with prophecies that kings would heed. Yet for every revered hermit like Cuthbert, there were a dozen nameless souls dismissed as lunatics, muttering to themselves on the edges of villages. The line between holiness and insanity was thin, and it often depended on who was telling the story. What made hermits so compelling was their radical rejection of comfort. While bishops wore silk and abbots dined on fine wine, hermits survived on roots, rainwater, and whatever scraps peasants left at their crude shelters. Their bodies became maps of suffering, sunken cheeks, matted hair, feet cracked from barefoot pilgrimages. But this very austerity gave them power. When a hermit spoke, people listened, believing their deprivation let them see truths hidden from the well-fed. Some, like the Hermitess Julian of Norwich, turned isolation into profound mysticism, writing visions of divine love that still resonate today. Others, like the infamous Mad Peter of Flanders, were feared for their apocalyptic rants, which could stir panics or rebellions if taken seriously. Kings and popes kept a wary eye on these holy outcasts. A hermit's blessing could legitimize a ruler, but their criticism could undermine entire regimes. Henry II famously sought out hermits for counsel after Thomas Becket's murder, desperate for absolution only to be told his penance would never be enough. Hermits had no armies or titles, yet their moral authority could shake thrones. That's why smart rulers sometimes planted their own hermits near strategic roads, where their pious reputations might sway travelers' loyalties. Now shift from the wilderness to the scriptorium, where a very different kind of devotion played out. If hermits sought God in solitude, medieval scholars found him in the painstaking preservation of knowledge letter by letter, page by page. These scribes and thinkers were the unsung engineers of the future, ensuring that ancient wisdom didn't vanish into the dark. Scholars were the silent architects of the medieval mind, bending over parchment by candlelight to preserve ideas that might otherwise have vanished into the dark. While knights won fame on battlefields and kings ruled with crowns and decrees, these men, often cloistered in monastery scriptoriums, fought a quieter battle against ignorance itself. Their ink-stained fingers copied not just scripture, but the works of Aristotle, Plato, and long-dead Roman thinkers, ensuring that the wisdom of antiquity survived Europe's chaotic centuries. Picture a Benedictine monk in the 10th century, his quill scratching across vellum as he painstakingly reproduces a crumbling Latin text. One mistake could distort knowledge for generations, yet he worked without glory, driven by faith in the power of words. Thomas Aquinas stands as the towering example of what these scholars could achieve. In the 13th century, his monumental Summa Theologica didn't just reconcile Christian doctrine with Aristotle's logic, it reshaped how entire civilizations thought about reason, ethics, and the divine. Universities like Paris and Bologna became battlegrounds for his ideas, where debates over a single sentence could rage for weeks, but Aquinas wasn't alone. Scholars like Peter Abelard, whose fiery lectures drew thousands, or Hildegard of Bingen, whose scientific and musical genius defied the era's limits on women, proved that medieval minds were far from backward. They asked questions about free will, the nature of time, even the cosmos, questions that still haunt us today. The tools of their trade were humble but revolutionary. The Carolingian minuscule, a clear script developed under Charlemagne, standardized handwriting across Europe, making texts readable from Spain to Saxony. Monasteries like Monte Cassino became nerve centers of learning, where scribes copied not just religious works but manuals on medicine, astronomy, and agriculture. A single book might take a year to complete. Its pages dyed with costly pigments like lapis lazuli for blue or crushed insects for crimson. These weren't just objects, they were treasure chests of thought, often chained to desks to prevent theft. Yet scholars faced constant tension with authority. When Oxford professor John Wycliffe translated the Bible into English in the 14th century, the church burned his followers as heretics. Knowledge was power, and those who controlled its flow could shape kingdoms. That's why the rise of universities beginning as loose guilds of teachers and students marked a seismic shift. By the 12th century, a poor but brilliant youth could study law in Bologna or medicine in Salerno, climbing social ladders once reserved for nobles. Education became currency and scholars its mint. Now, shift your gaze from the cloister's hush to the marketplace's clamor. If scholars guarded wisdom, merchants mastered something equally transformative: the art of turning silk, spice, and silver into networks of influence that would quietly undermine the feudal order itself. Merchants were the quiet revolutionaries of medieval Europe, men and women who built fortunes not with swords or land, but with silk, spice, and shrewd calculations. While nobles clung to titles inherited through bloodlines, merchants created their own dynasty of wealth, one that would quietly dismantle the feudal order. Picture the bustling docks of Venice or Bruges, where ships unloaded pepper from India, furs from Russia, and glassware from Damascus. The man brokering these deals might wear simpler clothes than a duke, but his coffers could bankroll wars. Take Cosimo de' Medici, who started as a wool trader and ended up financing popes and kings, his family's golden florins propping up entire governments. Money, they proved, could buy more than finery. It could rewrite the rules of power. Guilds were the merchant's secret weapon. These weren't just trade associations but shadow governments that controlled city streets, set prices, and even fielded militias. In places like Florence or Cologne, guild halls rivaled castles in grandeur, their meeting rooms where real decisions were made. A wool merchant might never hold a noble title, but if his guild dominated the city council, he could tax nobles' wine or block their trade routes. That's how men like Jacques Coeur of France rose from silversmith to royal treasurer. His financial acumen made him indispensable to a cash-strapped monarchy. Yet their ascent wasn't smooth. Nobles sneered at these upstarts, passing sumptuary laws to stop merchants from wearing ermine or gold cloth. The church condemned usury, forcing clever workarounds like letters of credit that birthed modern banking. And when merchants grew too powerful, backlash followed, like the Ciompi revolt in Florence, where textile workers burned the mansions of the guild elite. But the tide couldn't be turned. As trade routes expanded, so did merchant influence, planting the seeds of capitalism in feudal soil. Now, consider the hands that crafted the goods merchants sold, the artisans. If merchants moved the world's riches, craftsmen created them, their workshops turning raw materials into the luxuries nobles and merchants coveted. Their story is one of skill, pride, and quiet rebellion. Master craftsmen were the hidden geniuses behind medieval Europe's most breathtaking achievements, the ones who turned stone into soaring cathedrals, iron into unbreakable swords, and wood into intricate altar pieces that seemed touched by the divine. These weren't just laborers, they were artists and engineers rolled into one, their hands shaping the physical and spiritual landscape of an entire age. Take the stonemasons who built Chartres Cathedral, for example. Working without modern tools or blueprints, they carved delicate saints and grotesque gargoyles hundreds of feet in the air. Each chisel struck a testament to patience and precision. A single mistake could weaken an entire arch, yet their work still stands after 8 centuries. That's the kind of legacy a master craftsman left behind. But becoming one wasn't a matter of raw talent alone. The path from apprentice to master was grueling, often taking a decade or more. A young boy, rarely a girl, though exceptions existed, would be sent to a workshop at 7 or 8, spending years sweeping floors and mixing paints before even touching a chisel or forge. Only after mastering basics could he become a journeyman, traveling from city to city to learn new techniques. The final hurdle, crafting a masterpiece, not just a showpiece, but proof he could meet the guild's exacting standards. In Nuremberg, a locksmith's test might involve forging a lock so intricate even the guild elders couldn't pick it. Fail, and you stayed a journeyman forever. Pass, and you joined the elite. The rewards, though, were immense. A master goldsmith like the legendary Benvenuto Cellini could dine with popes, while armorers like the Missaglia family of Milan outfitted kings and became wealthy enough to rival nobles. Their workshops were medieval Silicon Valley's hubs of innovation where new alloys, dyes, and construction techniques were born. The stained glass of Saint-Chapelle in Paris, for instance, required craftsmen to melt cobalt and gold into glass, creating colors so vibrant they seemed lit from within. These weren't just tradesmen, they were alchemists turning raw materials into marvels, yet their power went beyond art. Guilds' tight-knit associations of craftsmen controlled entire industries, setting prices, wages, and quality standards. Cross a guild, and you might be banned from working in a city for life. When the stonemasons' Guild of Strasbourg demanded higher wages in the 14th century, they halted construction on the cathedral for months until the bishop caved. That's the paradox of the master craftsmen. Though technically commoners, their skills gave them leverage even nobles couldn't ignore. Now, shift your gaze from the glittering workshops to the muddy fields where most medieval lives unfolded. If master craftsmen were the celebrated few, peasants were the invisible many, the hands that fed kingdoms but rarely earned a line in the history books. Their story is one of survival, resilience, and quiet revolutions that would reshape the world. Peasants were the invisible engine that kept medieval Europe running, their calloused hands feeding kingdoms while their own bellies often went empty. Bound to the land through generations, they existed in a world where the soil beneath their feet wasn't truly theirs. It belonged to the lord of the manor, the monastery, or the crown. But don't mistake this for simple farming. A peasant's life was a complex web of obligations, where every harvested sheaf of wheat or bushel of barley came with strings attached. 1/3 typically went to the lord, another 1/10 to the church, leaving barely enough to survive the winter. And it wasn't just crops. Peasants owed days of back-breaking labor repairing roads, digging ditches, or even serving as makeshift soldiers when war came knocking. The gap between serfs and free peasants was vast, though outsiders might not spot the difference at first glance. Serfs couldn't leave their lord's land, marry without permission, or even grind grain at any mill but their lord's, where he took yet another cut of their meager harvest. Free peasants, on the other hand, might own tiny plots, passing them down like heirlooms. In places like medieval England, some even grew wealthy enough to hire laborers, blurring the lines between peasant and minor landowner. But freedom was fragile. A single bad harvest, a lord's raised taxes, or a raiding party could plunge a free family into debt bondage, tying them to the soil as effectively as any serfdom. Yet peasants weren't just passive victims. They developed shrewd ways to resist hiding grain from tax collectors, pretending ignorance of new laws, or quietly sabotaging oppressive lords' property. When pushed too far, they could erupt in revolts like the English Peasants' Rebellion of 1381, where tens of thousands marched on London demanding an end to serfdom. Their leader, Wat Tyler, wasn't some noble in disguise but a roofer's son who'd had enough. Though crushed brutally, these uprisings planted seeds of change, proving even the lowest could shake the foundations of feudalism. Now step beyond the plowed fields into the shadowy woods where outlaws lurked. If peasants were the system's cogs, these men and women were its broken gears, defiant, dangerous, and sometimes celebrated in ballads that turned thieves into folk heroes. Their stories reveal the frayed edges of medieval justice, where survival often meant living outside the law. Outlaws lived in the cracks of medieval society, neither bound by feudal oaths nor protected by noble privilege. These were the men and women who chose, or were forced, to exist beyond the law, surviving by their wits and the edge of a blade. While some were common thieves preying on travelers, others became legends like Robin Hood, the archetypal outlaw who robbed from the rich to give to the poor. Whether fact or fiction, these stories resonated because they exposed the hypocrisy of a system where nobles could exploit peasants without consequence, yet a starving man stealing bread might lose his hand. The line between villain and hero depended on who told the tale. Life as an outlaw was brutal and short, declared wolf's head. They could be hunted like animals, killed on sight by anyone without legal repercussions. Forests like England's Sherwood or Germany's Black Forest became their refuges, offering cover from sheriffs and bounty hunters, but survival required more than hiding. Outlaws formed tight-knit bands, creating their own codes of loyalty. Some, like Eustace the Monk, a pirate-turned-folk hero, commanded fleets and even served kings as mercenaries when it suited their interests. Others, like the infamous Cagots of France, were outcasts by birth, branded as untouchables and forced to live on society's fringes. Their existence was a silent protest against the rigid hierarchies that labeled them unclean. The most successful outlaws blurred the line between bandit and ruler. In the Scottish borders, reivers like Johnny Armstrong built veritable fortresses, raiding across England and Scotland with such impunity that kings negotiated with them as equals until the noose tightened. Armstrong's last words before execution reportedly shamed King James V for hanging, the most honest thief in Scotland. Even in death, outlaws could defy the powerful. Their ballads, sung in taverns and market squares, kept their defiance alive, turning them into symbols of resistance long after their bones had turned to dust. Now shift from the shadowy woods to the brightly lit halls of kings and nobles, where another kind of rebel operated, one who wore motley instead of a hood. Jesters might have been the only ones who could mock tyranny without losing their heads, proving that laughter could be as sharp as any sword. Jesters walked the razor's edge between laughter and treason, their motley costumes hiding some of the sharpest political minds of the Middle Ages. While knights and nobles bowed to kings, these court fools had a unique privilege licensed to mock tyrants to their faces without losing their heads. Their humor wasn't just entertainment, it was a survival tactic, wrapping brutal truths in riddles and song. Take Troubadours, the legendary jester of France's King Francis I. When he quipped that the monarch smelled like corpses after a battlefield victory, the insult could have meant death for anyone else. But Troubadours spun it as praise, claiming the stench proved the king's bravery, turning anger into roaring laughter. That's the jester's art, saying the unsayable, then dancing just out of reach of the blade. Yet their role went deeper than jokes. In an era when dissent meant execution, jesters acted as the king's living conscience, delivering hard truths disguised as folly. The Welsh jester Roland the Farter, yes, that was his real title, might have earned his keep with flatulence tricks, but his presence reminded rulers they were still human. A jester's antics mock coronations, exaggerated imitations of noble arrogance, were satire centuries before the term existed. Some, like England's Will Sommers, even shaped policy. His playful jabs at Henry VIII's marital chaos helped soften the king's infamous temper, proving that laughter could be a diplomat's best tool. But the job wasn't without risks. When the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund's jester joked about his master's failed military campaign, he was thrown into a dungeon. A fool's license had limits, especially when pride was wounded. The smartest jesters, like Shakespeare's fictional touchstone, mastered the art of plausible deniability, leaving rulers wondering whether they'd been insulted or flattered. Their legacy lingers in modern political cartoons and late-night monologues, where humor still pokes holes in power. Now, shift from the jester's biting laughter to the executioner's silent grimace. If jesters teased kings with words, these men delivered justice with steel, a role as feared as it was necessary. Their hooded faces hid identities, but their work shaped societies in ways few dared to acknowledge. Executioners were medieval justice's shadowy enforcers, their axes and ropes the final punctuation in laws written by kings. Unlike jesters who thrived on attention, executioners lived in society's margins, shunned by neighbors yet essential to order. Their title carried a paradox. They were both outcasts and pillars of authority. In Nuremberg, the famed executioner Franz Schmidt kept a meticulous diary, recording over 300 executions with eerie detachment. His entries reveal no glee, just the grim precision of a craftsman, because that's how many saw the work. A clean beheading was considered merciful, a botched one a disgrace. Some, like Paris's Charles Henry Sanson, even modernized methods, advocating for the guillotine as a more humane tool. Yet executioners weren't just death dealers. They often doubled as healers, their knowledge of anatomy from dissections making them skilled bone setters. In some towns, they ran pharmacies, dispensing cures alongside carrying out sentences. This duality, bringer of death and restorer of health, made them figures of eerie fascination. Parents might cross the street to avoid them, then secretly seek their remedies for a sick child. Their social isolation bred strange customs. Executioners often married within their own families, forming dynasties like the famed Luxembourg clan who served for generations. Touching their tools was taboo, yet their swords were sometimes borrowed for duels believed to carry lethal luck. And when plague struck, it was executioners who carted away corpses, their immunity to stigma making them indispensable in crises. What's rarely said is how executioners shaped law itself. Their feedback about methods influenced sentencing reforms. A hanged man who took minutes to die might lead to thicker ropes or standardized drop heights. In their own macabre way, they humanized justice, proving even the darkest roles carried unexpected weight. Now, consider the scribes who recorded their deeds, men who turned blood and verdicts into dry parchment records, yet held their own kind of power. Executioners lived in a strange paradox, feared and reviled, yet essential to the machinery of medieval justice. They carried out sentences that kept order in an era when public punishment was both spectacle and warning. While nobles and clergy passed judgment, it was the executioner who turned words into action, his axe or rope the final word in law. Take Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, a man who performed over 300 executions yet saw himself as a servant of justice, not a monster. His diary entries read like macabre court records detailing crimes from theft to murder, the tools he used, even how long victims struggled before death. These weren't just morbid notes, they were a meticulous chronicle of how medieval society drew the line between order and chaos. But executioners weren't just anonymous figures in black hoods. Many, like Schmidt, were skilled professionals who took pride in their grim craft. A clean beheading required precision, and a botched hanging could spark riots. In Paris, the Sanson family held the position for generations, refining techniques to make executions swifter and, ironically, more humane. Some even became unlikely celebrities. The executioner of Meudon, known for his efficiency, was said to have fans who cheered his strikes like a macabre performer. Yet no matter how respected, they couldn't escape their stigma. Executioners lived on the outskirts of towns, banned from ordinary trades, their children forbidden from marrying outside their insular circles. Their work extended beyond the scaffold. Many doubled as healers, their knowledge of anatomy from dissections making them sought after bone setters. In Prague, the executioner's house doubled as an apothecary, where locals whispered requests for cures after dark. This duality, bringer of death and restorer of health, made them figures of eerie fascination. Even their tools held strange power. Executioners' swords were sometimes borrowed for duels, believed to carry a lethal luck, while touching their ropes or axes was considered cursed. Now shift from the executioner's bloody block to the heralds, masters of symbolism who turned coats of arms into a language of power. If executioners enforced law with steel, heralds wielded the subtler weapons of color, crest, and ceremony, tools that could make or break noble reputations with a single proclamation. Heralds were the grand conductors of medieval pageantry, their voices cutting through the chaos of battlefields and tournament grounds alike. These weren't just glorified announcers. They were walking encyclopedias of heraldry, diplomacy, and protocol. Picture a jousting tournament. As armored knights thundered toward each other, it was the herald who identified them by their crests, shouting family mottos and tracing lineages back generations. Their expertise turned blazons, those intricate coats of arms, into a visual language. A lion rampant on a gold field wasn't just decoration. It declared a family's bravery and nobility, while a bend sinister might whisper of bastardy or ambition. Heralds could decode these symbols at a glance, ensuring no impostor claimed honors he hadn't earned, but their role extended far beyond tournaments. In war, heralds were the only figures granted safe passage between enemy camps. They delivered challenges, negotiated truces, and even arranged ransoms for captured nobles. During the 100 Years' War, English and French heralds exchanged messages with a formality that bordered on ritual, their words carrying the weight of kings. Some, like the famous French herald Montjoy, became legends in their own right, trusted enough to witness treaties and chronicle battles with near-sacred impartiality. Their records weren't just military accounts. They were the first drafts of history, shaping how future generations would remember victories and defeats. The College of Arms in London, founded in 1484, still stands as a testament to their enduring legacy. There, heralds meticulously documented every noble birth, marriage, and death, their scrolls becoming the backbone of aristocratic identity. A herald's proclamation could legitimize a king or ruin a usurper, as when Henry VII's heralds meticulously traced his shaky claim to the throne through twists of genealogy. Their work was part theater, part law, and entirely indispensable. Now shift from the precision of heraldry to the fluidity of song. If heralds were the keepers of noble truths, minstrels were the weavers of tales, transforming battles, scandals, and romances into melodies that echoed from taverns to throne rooms. Their verses turned history into legend, and sometimes legend into power. Minstrels were the wandering storytellers of the Middle Ages, turning gossip, battles, and romances into melodies that spread faster than any royal decree. While kings ruled lands and bishops saved souls, these roving poets controlled something equally powerful: public opinion. Picture a bustling castle hall after a feast, where a minstrel strums a lute and begins a ballad about Richard the Lionheart's crusades. Within weeks, that same song might echo in taverns from London to Jerusalem, shaping how ordinary people saw their rulers. A flattering tune could cement a noble's reputation, while a satirical verse might undo years of careful image-making. That's the minstrel's real power. They were medieval influencers long before the term existed, but their lives were far from glamorous. Celebrated minstrels like Blondel de Nesle, said to have wandered Europe singing under castle windows to locate his imprisoned king, enjoyed patronage and fine clothes. Others scraped by on coins tossed in dirty alehouses, their songs blending news with outright fabrication to please any paying audience. The line between artist and conman was thin. In 1277, King Edward I of England even issued a decree branding unattached minstrels as vagabonds, forcing them to serve a lord or face whipping. Yet despite the stigma, their role was vital. Before printing presses, minstrels were living archives, preserving histories like the Battle of Hastings or Elena of Aquitaine's scandals in verses passed down for generations. Their songs were more than entertainment, they were weapons. During the 100 Years' War, French minstrels composed ballads mocking the English king's claims, while English singers retaliated with tunes praising their victories. A clever minstrel could spin defeat into heroic tragedy or rebellion into righteous justice, all while strumming a catchy refrain. Some, like the mysterious Tannhäuser, blurred the line between fact and legend, their own lives becoming the stuff of song. And when minstrels weren't singing of kings, they chronicled everyday life, lovesick shepherds, cheating wives, even complaints about taxes giving voice to people history books usually ignored. Now shift from the minstrels' lively taverns to the dim, smoke-filled workshops of alchemists. If minstrels traded in stories, these enigmatic figures dealt in something far more elusive, the promise of turning base metals into gold and uncovering the secrets of eternal life. Their quest blended science, magic, and sheer desperation in ways that would shape the modern world. Alchemists were medieval Europe's most enigmatic figures, cloaked in secrecy and steeped in the tantalizing promise of unlocking nature's greatest mysteries. Their workshops, hidden in shadowy cellars or tucked behind monastery walls, hummed with the hiss of alembics and the glow of crucibles, where they pursued the legendary philosopher's stone, a substance said to turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. But these seekers weren't just dreamers chasing fairy tales. Behind the arcane symbols and cryptic manuscripts lay the roots of modern science. Take Paracelsus, the Swiss maverick who tossed traditional medical textbooks into bonfires and insisted on experimenting with minerals and chemicals to cure disease. His bold methods laid the groundwork for pharmacology, proving that alchemy wasn't just about greed or mysticism. It was a quest to understand the very fabric of the material world. Yet alchemy's reputation swung between reverence and suspicion. Kings like Rudolf II of Habsburg poured fortunes into patronizing alchemists, hoping to fill their coffers with manufactured gold. Meanwhile, the church eyed these practitioners warily, their experiments skirting the edge of heresy. An alchemist's success could earn them a royal pension. Failure might mean accusations of demonic pacts. The line between genius and fraud was perilously thin. Some, like the infamous Nicholas Flamel, became legends posthumously, their rumored discoveries spawning myths that outlived them. Others vanished into obscurity, their notebooks crammed with indecipherable codes that still baffle historians. What's often overlooked is how alchemy shaped everyday life. Their experiments gave us porcelain, improved metallurgy for weapons and coins, and even early forms of ink and dyes. The very language of chemistry, terms like distillation and amalgamation were born in their smoky labs. And while the philosopher's stone remained elusive, Their relentless curiosity paved the way for Newton's gravity and Boyle's gas laws. Alchemists were the bridge between magic and science, their failures as instructive as their triumphs. Now, step from the alchemist's dim workshop into the stark chambers of the Inquisitor, where faith became a weapon and heresy was hunted with chilling precision. If alchemists danced on the edge of forbidden knowledge, Inquisitors were the ones who decided where that edge lay, and who had crossed it. Their courts wielded a power more terrifying than any king's army, blending piety with punishment in ways that would leave scars for centuries. Inquisitors were the shadowy enforcers of medieval faith, men who wielded crosses like swords and turned confession chambers into battlegrounds for souls. Their very title, from the Latin inquisitio, meaning inquiry, masked the brutal reality of their work. Picture a dimly lit chamber where a suspected heretic sits chained, confronted by a robed figure demanding answers about unorthodox beliefs. The Inquisitor wasn't just a priest, he was judge, jury, and sometimes executioner, armed with the Church's absolute authority to root out dissent. Torquemada, Spain's most infamous inquisitor, epitomized this chilling role. Under his watch, thousands faced torture, imprisonment, or the stake, all in the name of purifying Christendom. Yet what's often forgotten is that many inquisitors genuinely believed they were saving souls, not just from earthly punishment, but from eternal damnation. Their methods were systematic and terrifying. Trials rarely involved lawyers or defense witnesses. Instead, the accused faced leading questions designed to trap them in contradictions. Denial could mean torture strappado, where victims were suspended by their wrists until joints dislocated, or the rack, which stretched bodies to the point of agony. Confessions extracted this way were considered valid, a twisted logic that ensured few escaped unscathed. Inquisitors kept meticulous records, their notebooks filled with testimonies that often implicated entire families or villages. A single whispered rumor about skipping Mass or questioning church doctrine could spark an investigation lasting years. The ripple effects devastated communities, turning neighbors into informants and sowing fear that lingered for generations. Yet the Inquisition wasn't monolithic. Early versions, like the medieval Inquisition of the 13th century, focused on reconciling heretics through penance rather than punishment. Only the unrepentant faced execution, but by the 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition, fueled by anti-Semitism and political paranoia, became a tool for consolidating power. Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, called conversos, lived under constant suspicion of secretly practicing their old faith. Their wealth often made them targets, with confiscated property funding the Inquisition's operations. This dark marriage of faith and greed stains the institution's legacy. What's rarely acknowledged is how inquisitors shaped modern legal systems. Their insistence on written evidence and standardized procedures influenced secular courts. The very concept of a trial owes something to their methods, however grim. Even the term Inquisition survives today as shorthand for relentless scrutiny. Their story forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions. Can cruelty ever be justified by conviction? How thin is the line between zealotry and justice? Now shift from the Inquisitors' smoke-filled chambers to the sun-scorched battlefields of the Holy Land, where another kind of holy warrior fought under the banner of the cross. If Inquisitors policed faith at home, Crusaders carried it abroad, their swords consecrated by popes and their ambitions cloaked in piety. Their campaigns would redefine medieval Europe's relationship with power, faith, and the wider world. Crusaders marched under the banner of the cross, their swords blessed by popes and their vows echoing through Christendom. But beneath the holy rhetoric lay motives as tangled as the battlefields they fought on. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, his call to free Jerusalem from Muslim rule stirred thousands to take up arms, driven by promises of spiritual redemption and earthly rewards. What began as a pilgrimage of faith quickly revealed its contradictions. Knights like Godfrey of Bouillon became immortalized as pious warriors, yet many Crusaders looted Christian cities like Constantinople before even reaching the Holy Land, proving greed and glory often outweighed devotion. Richard the Lionheart embodied this duality, celebrated in ballads for his battlefield brilliance during the Third Crusade. He spent barely 6 months in England during his decade-long reign, preferring the sands of Palestine to his own rainy kingdom. His rivalry with Saladin, the Muslim Sultan, became the stuff of legend, a clash of cultures romanticized as chivalrous combat, but reality was messier. Richard's massacre of 2,600 Muslim prisoners at Acre showed how quickly Crusader idealism crumbled into brutality. For every noble gesture, there were sieges where starving civilians ate their own horses or wells poisoned to stall advancing armies. The Crusades' legacy stretched far beyond battlefields. They dragged Europe into the wider world, introducing spices, silks, and Arab scholarship to the West while hardening religious divides that still echo today. Crusader states like the Kingdom of Jerusalem became fragile experiments in feudal rule abroad, their castles rising from deserts like mirages. Yet their greatest impact might have been on European identity itself, the idea that Christendom could unite under a shared cause for better or worse. Now shift from the clamor of Crusader camps to the courts where troubadours turned war into art. If Crusaders wielded swords, these poets carried a different kind of weapon, lyrics that could glorify knights or expose their hypocrisies with equal flair. Their songs wove tales of chivalry so enchanting they'd redefine nobility itself. Troubadours were the rock stars of the medieval world, spinning tales of love, war, and scandal into melodies that seduced courts and taverns alike. These wandering poets didn't just entertain, they shaped the very ideals of chivalry and romance that still color our imaginations today. Picture a candlelit hall in 12th century Provence, where a noblewoman blushes behind her fan as a troubadour sings of forbidden passion, his verses towing the line between devotion and defiance. The most famous, like Bernard de Ventadorn, turned unrequited love into high art, penning lyrics so stirring they convinced knights to joust for ladies they'd never met. But beneath the glittering surface of courtly love lay a delicious irony. Many troubadours were themselves minor nobles, using poetry as a backdoor to power. By flattering dukes or mocking rivals in verse, they could sway politics without drawing a sword. The troubadour's life wasn't all roses and sonnets, though. Those without noble blood relied on fickle patrons. A wrong rhyme about a lord's receding hairline could mean exile or worse. Père Vidal, known for his outrageous stunts, once dressed in wolf skins to impress a countess and was nearly hunted by local shepherds. Yet their risks paid off culturally. Their songs codified finamur, refined love, a code where knights suffered nobly for unreachable ladies, a notion that seeped into everything from Arthurian legends to modern rom-coms. The hypocrisy was rich. These poets praised purity while nobles bedded servants, and songs of Crusader bravery often ignored the bloodshed left behind. Women troubadours or Troubadours added another layer. The Countess of Dyer's fiery lyrics accused lovers of cowardice, turning gender roles upside down. Her defiant A Chanter remains the only surviving melody by a medieval woman composer, proof that even in a man's world, voices slipped through the cracks. Now shift from the troubadour's lute to the Guildmaster's ledger. If poets traded in fleeting emotions, these men and women dealt in something more concrete, control over the very goods and skills that kept medieval life running. Their power didn't come from songs, but from monopolies so tight they could make or break entire cities. Guildmasters were the undisputed rulers of medieval craftsmanship, wielding authority that blurred the lines between businessman, politician, and community leader. These weren't just skilled artisans, they were the gatekeepers of entire trades, controlling who could work, what they could charge, and even how goods were made. Picture a bustling wool market in 14th century Flanders, where guild masters inspected every bolt of cloth for flaws, their seals of approval meaning the difference between premium prices and financial ruin for the weavers. Their power extended far beyond quality control. Guilds set wages, resolved disputes between members, and even provided pensions for widows, creating a medieval version of social security. The goldsmith guilds of Paris, for instance, didn't just craft jewelry, they operated as private mints, their marks guaranteeing the purity of coins that circulated across Europe. What made guild masters truly formidable was their monopoly on knowledge. Becoming one wasn't a matter of talent alone. It required years of grueling apprenticeship, followed by journeyman work across multiple cities to master regional techniques. The final hurdle, creating a masterpiece, not just a showpiece, but proof you could meet the guild's exacting standards. In Nuremberg, a master locksmith might have to forge a mechanism so intricate even seasoned craftsmen couldn't pick it. This system maintained quality but also kept competition ruthlessly low. Guilds fiercely guarded their trade secrets, punishing members who shared techniques with outsiders. When the Venetian glassmakers discovered a defector teaching their methods abroad, they reportedly sent assassins to silence him, proof of how seriously they took their intellectual property. Yet their influence wasn't purely economic. Guild halls doubled as civic centers, their grand facades proclaiming the pride of butchers, bakers, and candle makers alike. In cities like Ghent or Cologne, guilds fielded militias that rivaled noble armies, turning craftsmen into a political force. The Florentine Wool Guild, Art della Lana, literally built the city's cathedral, their emblem still visible on its towering walls. Some masters grew wealthy enough to challenge noble Jacques Coeur, a French silk merchant, financed a king's wars before being brought down by jealous aristocrats. Their legacy endures in modern labor unions, professional licenses, even business cartels, all echoes of a system where skill and solidarity could trump birthright. Now shift from the smoky guild halls to the open skies, where another elite craftsman practiced his art. Falconers were the medieval world's elite animal trainers, their birds serving as both hunting partners and status symbols. Unlike the guild masters' ledger books, their tools were jesses, hoods, and the piercing cries of raptors, a language of feathers and precision that few could master. Falconers occupied a unique niche in medieval society, part huntsman, part scientist, and entirely indispensable to nobility. Their craft wasn't just about taming wild birds, it was an intricate dance of patience and instinct, where a mistimed gesture could mean losing a prized peregrine forever. Kings like Frederick II of Sicily wrote entire treatises on falconry, detailing how to train eagles to take down cranes or merlins to chase skylarks. These birds were more than pets, they were living extensions of aristocratic power. A gyrfalcon, gifted by Norwegian kings to European monarchs, could be worth as much as a knight's yearly income, their white feathers symbolizing purity and dominance. The falconer's day began before dawn, carefully weighing each bird to ensure perfect hunting condition. Too heavy and the falcon wouldn't chase prey, too light and it might weaken mid-flight. They carried an arsenal of tools, leather hoods to calm aggressive birds, tiny bells to track them through dense forests, even handmade lures decorated with pigeon wings to simulate prey. Their knowledge bordered on mystical. Medieval manuscripts describe falconers diagnosing illnesses by studying a bird's droppings or using herbs to mend broken feathers. The best became celebrities. Edward III's royal falconer received land grants rivaling those of minor barons, yet their world wasn't all glamour. Training a hawk required weeks of sleepless nights, holding the bird on your glove until it stopped fearing humans. Some species, like the temperamental goshawk, were notorious for attacking their handlers. The celebrated falconer Bertrand de Born joked that working with them was like taming lightning. And when a prized bird was lost, a frequent tragedy, falconers faced furious lords demanding compensation. Theirs was a life of constant tension, balancing the wildness of their charges with the exacting demands of nobility. In an era where hunting was both sport and survival, the falconer's skill meant the difference between a feast and humiliation. Now consider the quieter counterparts to these avian experts, the grooms and stable masters who cared for the medieval world's other essential animals. If falconers ruled the skies, these men controlled the earthbound engines of war and transport, horses. Falconers held a unique place in the medieval hierarchy, neither fully noble nor common, yet indispensable to both. Their mastery over birds of prey wasn't just a pastime. It was a sophisticated language of control and prestige, where the flutter of a falcon's wings could signify a lord's dominance as clearly as a castle's battlements. Kings like Frederick II of Sicily didn't merely dabble in falconry. They obsessed over it, penning exhaustive manuals like De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, The Art of Hunting with Birds, which dissected everything from avian anatomy to the ethics of hunting. These treatises weren't just instructions, they were philosophical manifestos, arguing that falconry mirrored the divine order itself, with man as steward of nature's fiercest creatures. The birds themselves were living status symbols. A snowy gyrfalcon from the Arctic, gifted between monarchs, could command a price equivalent to a village's annual harvest. Lesser nobles made do with peregrines or sparrowhawks, while even a well-trained kestrel could elevate a knight's reputation. The falconer's role was to bridge this gap between wildness and refinement. Daybreak began with meticulous rituals, weighing each bird to the ounce, adjusting diets to hone aggression, and sewing tiny leather hoods to keep them calm amid the chaos of court. A single misstep, a hood tied too tight, a jest strap left frayed could spell disaster. The celebrated falconer Simon Latham warned that a hungry hawk will forsake the glove for the woods, recounting tales of prized birds vanishing into the treetops, lured by the call of the wild. Yet the falconer's artistry extended beyond training. They were medieval zoologists, diagnosing ailments by studying droppings or mending broken feathers with wax and thread. Their tools, silver whistles to recall birds, gauntlets lined with sturgeon skin to deflect talons, were as specialized as a surgeon's instruments. In an age when hunting fed armies and cemented alliances, their expertise was geopolitical. When the Holy Roman Emperor gifted falcons to the Sultan of Egypt, it wasn't just a gesture of goodwill, it was a strategic move, acknowledging shared aristocratic values that transcended religion. Now shift from the open skies to the hallowed halls of legend, where the title Paladin conjures images of gleaming armor and unshakable virtue. If falconers embodied the harmony between man and nature, paladins represented the ideal fusion of piety and martial prowess, a fantasy that would outlive the Middle Ages itself. Paladins were the knights who blurred the line between mortal warriors and saints, their legend forged in the fires of Charlemagne's wars, but their image polished to near mythic brilliance by generations of storytellers. Originally, these 12 elite fighters served as the emperor's personal retinue, men like Roland, whose doomed stand at Roncesvalles Pass became the stuff of epic poetry. But what began as a historical corps of bodyguards morphed into something far grander, the archetype of the perfect knight, where martial skill and moral purity fused into one. Imagine a warrior who could cleave through enemy lines with one hand while dispensing justice with the other, his armor as unblemished as his soul. That's the paladin of legend, a figure so idealized he became more symbol than soldier. The real paladins of Charlemagne's era were formidable, but their deeds were grounded in the gritty realities of 8th century warfare. Roland's historical counterpart likely died in a skirmish with Basque raiders, not the vast Saracen armies of the Song of Roland. Yet poets transformed that defeat into a cosmic struggle between Christendom and Islam, complete with angelic interventions and a horn blast heard across continents. This wasn't just creative license, it was political propaganda, weaponizing nostalgia for Charlemagne's reign to fuel later crusades. The paladin became a rallying cry, a reminder that warriors could be holy and holiness could be militant. By the High Middle Ages, paladin had outgrown its Frankish roots, becoming shorthand for any knight who embodied the chivalric trifecta of piety, prowess, and loyalty. In Italy, condottieri like Sir John Hawkwood were dubbed paladins by admiring chroniclers despite their mercenary contracts. The term stretched like a suit of armor, fitting everyone from Teutonic knights battling pagans in the Baltic to fictional heroes like King Arthur's Galahad. Even the Vatican got in on the act, awarding the title Paladin of the Holy See to warriors who defended papal interests. The irony was rich. Men who slaughtered for pay or politics could be laundered into saints by the right storyteller. What's fascinating is how paladins colonized the imagination long after plate armor rusted. Renaissance romances, Victorian poetry, and even modern fantasy games keep resurrecting them, each iteration adding new layers to the myth. Dungeons and Dragons didn't invent the holy warrior trope. It bottled lightning first sparked by medieval bards. Today's paladins, whether in World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy, still carry echoes of Roland's Horn and Charlemagne's Dream, proof that some titles refuse to fade into history's footnotes. Now step back and consider the tapestry we've unfurled. From kings who claimed divine right to peasants who overturned it, from jesters who mocked power to executioners who enforced it, these titles weren't just labels. They were living, breathing contracts written in blood and ink that shaped how millions lived, fought, and dreamed. The medieval world may be centuries gone, but its echoes linger in our boardrooms, our governments, even our video games. Every time we call someone a boss, a knight in shining armor, or a rebel without a cause, we're speaking in the ghosts of these old titles, still carrying their weight and wonder. The past never really dies, it just waits for us to listen. Titles in the Middle Ages weren't just fancy words, they were the scaffolding that held feudal society together, dictating who wielded power, who bowed, and who bridged the gap between the two. A king's crown might gleam with divine right, but his authority meant nothing without dukes to command armies, bishops to bless his rule, and peasants to till the soil that fed his court. Each title was a thread in a vast, intricate tapestry, woven so tightly that pulling one strand could unravel entire kingdoms. Take the humble knight. His oath of loyalty to a baron might seem straightforward, but that bond rippled outward, supporting the baron's allegiance to a count, the count's duty to a duke, and the duke's fealty to the king. This wasn't just hierarchy, it was an ecosystem of obligation where every role, no matter how small, kept the machine running, yet titles were also weapons. A clever noble could wield them like a dagger, bestowing honors to secure loyalty or stripping them away as punishment. When William the Conqueror handed out English lands to his Norman followers after 1066, he wasn't just rewarding allies, he was dismantling Saxon power structures brick by brick. Conversely, the Magna Carta proved that even kings weren't untouchable. When barons united under their shared title, they could force a monarch to his knees. Titles granted identity, but they also carried the weight of expectation. A Viscount wasn't just a deputy, he was a living contract, sworn to uphold justice or risk losing status. And for peasants, the absence of titles spoke volumes. Their namelessness in records underscored how feudal society measured worth by rank, not labor. What's startling is how these medieval labels echo today. Modern CEOs and politicians might not wear crowns, but corporate titles like director or vice president still dictate power flows, just as duke and baron once did. Even our language preserves these old divisions. Think of landlord, a term straight from the feudal playbook. The Middle Ages might seem distant, but their structures linger in the way we organize, govern, and even introduce ourselves. Understanding these titles isn't just history, it's a mirror reflecting how humans have always sought to define, control, and occasionally rebel against the roles they're given. Whether etched in parchment or a linked in bio, titles remain the silent architects of our world. Medieval titles were more than just ornate labels. They were the DNA of an entire social order, encoding everything from battlefield authority to dinner table seating. These names didn't merely describe power, they created and enforced it, shaping lives with the weight of tradition and the threat of steel. Think of the humble knight sworn to serve versus the duke who commanded thousands. A single word could dictate whether you spent your days tilling fields or ruling them, whether your children inherited castles or spent generations bound to the same patch of dirt. The difference between baron and viscount might seem like semantics today, but in the Middle Ages it determined who sat at the king's council and who fetched his wine. What's astonishing is how these titles evolved from practical roles into symbols that outlived their original purposes. A marquis began as a frontier warlord defending borderlands, yet centuries later, the title became a ceremonial honor handed to politicians who'd never seen a sword. The church's cardinals, once just senior clergy, transformed into kingmakers whose red robes signaled influence stretching from Rome to the farthest cathedral. Even the lowly sergeant, originally a servant who carried a lord's armor, climbed the ranks to become a military rank we still use today. These words weren't static. They were alive, shifting with politics, war, and the relentless tide of ambition. And let's not forget the dark side of these glittering titles. For every noble praised in chronicles, there were countless others crushed under their weight. Peasants who couldn't pronounce their lord's full string of honors still felt their lash, while queens like Anne Boleyn discovered that a crown could be a prelude to the executioner's block. Titles promised glory but demanded blood, whether in battle, childbirth, or the shadowy plots of royal courts. The very language of nobility was a double-edged sword, elevating some while locking others into lives of servitude. Yet here's the twist: these medieval labels never truly disappeared. They just shape-shifted. Modern CEOs and Silicon Valley barons wield power eerily similar to their feudal counterparts, while terms like diplomatic immunity echo the old rights of ambassadors and heralds. Even our love for underdog stories, the rogue who becomes king, the peasant who rises, stems from a world where titles were both prison and key. The past isn't dead, it's hiding in plain sight, whispering through the words we still use to rank, reward, and rule. So the next time you hear someone called a boss, leader, or pioneer, remember, you're hearing the ghost of a 1,000-year-old system. These titles might not come with castles or crusades anymore, but they carry echoes of the same human cravings for respect, control, and legacy. History's labels stick around because they work, adapting to new eras while keeping their ancient cores. Want to see the Middle Ages in action? Just listen to how we talk about power today. If this journey through the tangled roots of nobility sparked your curiosity, smash that like button and let me know in the comments which title surprised you the most. Was it the merchant who out-earned dukes or the jester who mocked kings and lived to joke another day? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden corners. After all, the past isn't just a series of dates and dead people, it's the blueprint for everything we are now. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, behind every word there's